Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every Friday looking at all aspects of the past. Today on History Calling, I'm going to be telling you the history of the Hope Diamond. This stunning blue stone has had a roller coaster of a ride since it was discovered in 17th century India and is famously supposed to be cursed, doomed to bring misery and even death to those who own it and their families. In this video, I'll take you through the diamond's known history, including its time as part of the crown jewels of France, its connection with the tragic Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, how it was stolen from Paris as the French Revolution raged, whether it was worn by a King of England, and how it ended up around the necks of two Americans with rags to riches tales, one a Pennsylvanian actress turned aristocrat, the other a flamboyant socialite. You'll also learn why it's called the Hope Diamond, what gives it its incredibly rare blue colour, and what not one but two famed jewellers, Pierre Cartier and Harry Winston, have to do with the story. Stay till the end and I'll answer the most intriguing question of all. Is the Hope Diamond really cursed? Before we jump in, please remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on, and follow me on Instagram. I'll leave a link to my account in the description box below. I'll also leave links there to some additional sources on the Hope Diamond, including some free material if you'd like to learn more. Let's start with the technical stuff. The Hope Diamond is a 45.52 carat stone, 25.6 millimeters long, 21.78 millimeters wide, and 12 millimeters deep. It's officially described as being a fancy dark greyish blue, and it's this colour, caused by minute traces of boron within the stone, which makes it so remarkable. According to a 2014 article in the journal Rocks and Minerals, details in the description box, only 0.1% of all diamonds found at the Cullinan mine in South Africa, which is currently the most productive source of blue diamonds, are blue. And of those known to humanity, the Hope Diamond is, quote, one of the largest and most valuable. Today it resides in the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., usually surrounded by 16 white diamonds and on a chain which contains a further 45, though occasionally it's removed from this setting and placed in a different one. It hasn't always had such a sedate and respectable existence, however. The earliest record we have of the diamond indicates that it was discovered in India in the mid-17th century. No one seems quite sure of the year, however, and the exact circumstances surrounding this discovery are unknown. The Smithsonian's website suggests it came from the Color mine in Golconda, but this would seem to be because its first owner, a French merchant traveller named Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, noted in a later published work that he often acquired diamonds there. He didn't explicitly say that this is where he acquired the future Hope Diamond, however, though as India was the only known source of diamonds at the time, it has to have come from that country. The stone as he knew it was very different to what we see today, for it was originally 112 3/16 of a carat and had a roughly triangular shape. Known at this stage as the Tavernier Blue, we have this picture of it as it looked at that point. Even by the time this image was published in 1678, though, the diamond had changed hands and shape. Tavernier sold it to King Louis XIV of France in either 1668 or 1669, sources differ, for 220,000 livres. And by 1673, the king had had it cut into a 67 1/8 carat stone, which soon became known as the French Blue, or the Blue Diamond of the Crown. In 1691, it was set into gold and mounted on a stick, according to an inventory of the French crown jewels taken in that year. We might wonder why anyone would want to cut such a large diamond to make it smaller, but this process allowed any imperfections to be removed and the stone to be shaped and faceted so that it would better catch and reflect light. The jewel now stayed in the hands of the French royal family until the end of the 18th century. Passing to Louis XV, then the ill-fated Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. In 1749, Louis XV had it reset into the insignia of the French chivalric order, the Order of the Golden Fleece. Again, we have a picture showing what it looked like at this stage. This insignia was a ceremonial piece of jewellery not designed for day-to-day use, and it would have been worn only very rarely by the king. There is no reason to think it was ever worn at all by the Queen. This will be important when we get to a discussion of the so-called curse of the Hope diamond shortly. When the French Revolution broke out, the crown jewels were seized by the revolutionaries, but the French blue was then stolen from Paris in September 1792 and promptly disappeared. The former king and queen were sent to the guillotine the following year, and if you'd like to learn more about that, see my video on the mystery surrounding whether Marie Antoinette's hair suddenly turned white the night before her death. I'll leave it linked on screen and below. 20 years went by. Then, in London in 1812, a jeweller by the name of John François wrote and drew this memorandum, describing a fantastical blue diamond weighing 177 grains. 4 grains equals 1 carat, so he's saying it's about 44¼ carats, which is very close to the Hope diamond. The memorandum states, "The above drawing is the exact size and shape of a very curious, superfine deep blue diamond, brilliant cut and equal to a fine deep blue sapphire. It is beautiful and all perfection, without specks or flaws, and the colour even and perfect all over the diamond. I traced it round the diamond with a pencil, by leave of Mr. Daniel Eliason, and it is as finely cut as I have ever seen in a diamond. The colour of the drawing is as near the colour of the diamond as possible. John François, No. 24 Norfolk Street, Strand, London, 19th of September, 1812. There are a few things to note about this document. First, this stone doesn't look like the French blue. It's smaller and instead looks like the modern Hope diamond. Second, François and presumably Eliason didn't explain where it had come from, which is very fishy. Third, remember that blue diamonds are incredibly rare, even more so when they're of this size. The chances of having one go missing in Paris in 1792 and another unrelated diamond with no provenance show up in 1812 are very low. Finally, look at the date on this letter. It's almost precisely 20 years after the French blue was stolen, and the statute of limitations set by the post-revolutionary French government in 1804 for crimes committed during the Revolution just happens to have been 20 years. In other words, once that deadline had passed, the stone could be produced and sold, and the French government wouldn't have been able to demand it back. The conclusion reached by modern scholars is that the Hope diamond, which we first see in this drawing, is a cut-down version of the French blue, altered in order to attempt to disguise its origins. This theory was given further weight in 2007 by the discovery of a lead cast of a diamond in the Paris Museum of Natural History. The tag on this cast reads, "Replica of a blue diamond belonging to Monsieur Hope of London." The size and shape of the cast, which could have been made at any point between 1668 and 1792, matches pictures and descriptions of the French blue, while the Hope diamond's dimensions mean that it would fit perfectly inside it and could certainly have been cut from it. The tag indicates that at the time it was written in the 19th century, it was an accepted fact that the French blue had become the Hope diamond. The stone pops up in the records a few times over the next 27 years. In 1813, the writer John Maw commented in his book on diamonds and precious stones that there is at this time a superlatively fine blue diamond of above 44 carats in the possession of an individual in London, which may be considered as matchless and of course of arbitrary value. In a pamphlet which historian Jack Ogden, whose article I'll leave details of in the description box, has identified as having been printed in that same year, 1813, the diamond appears again complete with colour drawing. It is once more described as being 177 grains or 44¼ carats, and in the possession of a Mr. Daniel Eliason. 4 years later, another writer, Mr. James Sowerby, stated that Daniel Eliason, Esquire, has in London a nearly perfect blue brilliant of 44½ carats that is superior to any other coloured diamond known. In 1823, a later edition of Maw's book was published, and in this he described the stone as a superlatively fine blue diamond weighing 44 carats and valued at £30,000, formerly the property of Mr. Eliason, an eminent diamond merchant, is now said to be in the possession of our most gracious sovereign, meaning George IV. This unrivaled gem is of a deep sapphire blue, and from its rarity and colour might have been estimated at a higher sum. It has found its most worthy destination in passing into the possession of a monarch whose refined taste has ever been conspicuous in the highest degree. This strongly suggests that George IV obtained the diamond at some point between 1817 and 1823, and newspaper reports in 1822 did claim that he had purchased a violet-coloured diamond, which Eliasson was setting for him. At the time, the term violet could be used to describe the kind of deep blue colour we see in the Hope diamond. There is no definitive record of him having owned it within the British Royal Archives, however. He is seen wearing what appears to be the diamond in portraits such as this one, though, but it's impossible to tell if it's the same stone or a sapphire. What's more, there remains in the royal collection today an insignia which looks very much like this one and which does indeed hold a sapphire. By 1832, the stone was in the possession of Henry Philip Hope, and it's from him that it gets its current name. We don't know where and when he acquired it, but if George IV owned it, it was likely quietly sold off after the king's death to help settle his debts. This image of it dates to an 1839 catalogue of Hope's gemstone collection, and combined with the accompanying description, leaves us in no doubt that this is the same diamond François drew in 1812. It reads, "A most magnificent and rare brilliant, of a deep sapphire blue, of the greatest purity, and most beautifully cut. It is of true proportions, not too thick nor too spread. This matchless gem combines the beautiful colour of the sapphire with the prismatic fire and brilliancy of the diamond, and on account of its extraordinary colour, great size, and other fine qualities, it certainly may be called unique. Diamonds are found of almost every colour, which is proved by the great variety of coloured diamonds in this collection, but the blue colour is the most rare and most valuable, since there has very seldom been found a diamond of any size of a fine deep sapphire blue. It would therefore be a difficult task to form a just estimate of the value of this unrivaled gem, there being no precedent. The value cannot be established by comparison. The price which was once asked for this diamond was £30,000, but we must confess, for the above stated reasons, that it might have been estimated even at a higher sum. This beautiful gem is most tastefully mounted as a medallion, with a border on arabesque of small rose diamonds surrounded by 20 brilliants of equal size, shape and cutting, and of the finest water, and averaging 4 grains each. Its weight is 177 grains. The diamond remained in the Hope family for the next 62 years, passing first to Henry Philip Hope's nephew, Henry Thomas Hope, then to his daughter, then to her son, Lord Francis Hope, who was married to the American actress May Yo. Lord Hope had serious financial problems, and so in 1901 he sold the stone to a London gemstone dealer, Adolph Vail. It was soon sold on to Joseph Frankels and Sons of New York, who struggled to resell it, but eventually did so in 1908 to a diamond dealer named Salamin or Salim Habib, who may or may not have been acting on behalf of the Sultan of Turkey. The diamond trail briefly gets a little fuzzy at this point, as there are conflicting reports as to whether the Sultan ever actually owned it, but in 1909 it was bought by the Paris gemstone dealer Simon Rousseau, or C.H. Rousseau, I've seen him called both, who quickly sold it on to the famous jeweller Pierre Cartier. Cartier now came up with an ingenious way to sell the diamond himself. He showed it to the wealthy American socialite Mrs. Evelyn Walsh McLean in Paris in 1910, and when she initially didn't like it due to its setting, he had it reset, then loaned it to her in New York for the weekend. That did the trick. Evelyn fell in love with the Hope, and she bought it in 1912 for $180,000. She owned it until her death in 1947, and there are numerous photographs of her wearing it, as you see here. After she'd passed away, the stone was sold in 1949 to another famous jeweller, Harry Winston. He kept it for nearly a decade, showing it around the world before donating it to the Smithsonian Institute. It was sent by regular post, as shocking as that may be, and delivered in this very package by a postman named James Todd on the 10th of November 1958. That is how it has come to rest in the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. Having long been thought to weigh 44.5 carats, it was reweighed in 1974 and found to actually be 45.52. The boron particles within it, which give it its spectacular blue colour, have also given it another gift. When placed under shortwave UV light, the stone glows blood red for a few seconds afterwards. But now that you have an understanding of its history, what about the infamous curse? The Hope Diamond supposedly brings misery and death to those who own it. The stories around it vary slightly, but an excerpt from an article in the Times newspaper from the 15th of December 1967 gives you a good idea of the legends attached to it. It says, "The story is that the 44.5 carat stone was ripped from the forehead of an Indian idol and came into the hands of a French traveller, meaning Tavernier, who was later torn to death by a pack of rabid dogs. Louis XIV of France is said to have given it to Madame de Montespan, who was his mistress, as a mark of royal favour, which she lost soon after. Louis XVI, the legend says, gave it to Marie Antoinette, and it disappeared when they were executed in 1793. As far as Mrs. Evelyn Walsh McLean was concerned, her first son was killed in a car accident, her husband died in a mental home, and a daughter died of an overdose of sleeping pills in 1946. The Hope family is said to have fallen on evil days after buying the diamond, and the catalogue of owners in the 16 years before Mrs. McLean includes Jacques Collet, who killed himself, Prince Ivan Kanatovitsky, who was murdered, Sultan Abdul Hamid of Turkey, who was dethroned, and a mistress who was murdered, and Simon Montherides, whose carriage was dragged over a cliff by a shying horse, killing himself, his wife, and their child. Other sources, including additional articles published in the Times during the early to mid-20th century, add a few extra details. These include the stories that the diamond was also worn by Marie Antoinette's friend, the Princess de Lamballe, who was murdered by a mob during the French Revolution, that Lord Francis Hope went broke, and that his one-time wife, May Yo, died in poverty, having had several failed marriages, and that the postman who delivered it to the Smithsonian in 1958 was soon after struck by a series of disasters. Like all good legends, the stories of the supposed effects of the curse of the Hope Diamond do include some truths, but many of the more lurid aspects of the tale can be proven wrong. In the final part of this video, I'm therefore going to do my best to unpick fact from fiction for you. The origin of the curse was supposedly the theft of the diamond from the forehead of a Hindu god, though sometimes you'll hear it was his eye. This story comes from an anecdote Jean-Baptiste Tavernier told in his published account of his travels, in which he said that he had heard that a traveller deliberately allowed himself to be locked in an Indian pagoda or temple one night with the intention of stealing a stone from one of the eyes of an idol contained within, and that when the door was opened the following morning and he went to step outside with the gem, he dropped dead. The story has nothing to do with the Hope Diamond. Tavernier was not saying that this was how he obtained it, or any other stone, and in fact we have no real evidence that this incident or a variation of it ever occurred. However, the story was picked up by Pierre Cartier and repeated to Evelyn Walsh McLean, no doubt in order to increase the mystique around the stone and therefore its value. Evelyn wrote in her memoir, Father Struck It Rich, that the jeweller told her that he understood that Tavernier had stolen the gem from a Hindu, perhaps a Hindu god. My recollection is that he said Tavernier afterwards was torn and eaten by wild dogs. It's all rubbish. Tavernier died in his 80s in Russia in 1689 and of natural causes. No dogs were involved. We've already seen what happened to Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, but as I mentioned earlier, there is no record of the Queen ever having worn the French blue. Her friend, the Princess de Lamballe, did indeed meet a horrific end at the hands of the revolutionaries, but again, there is no evidence that she ever wore the diamond, and plenty of people came to awful ends during this period of French history who had no connection with the stone. Some parts of the story are true. Lord Francis Hope did indeed go bankrupt, though it was because he spent money like there was no tomorrow, and his ex-wife, May Yo, did die in poverty in 1938 after a series of failed marriages. The diamond was a drain on the finances of Joseph Frankels and Sons after they purchased it, largely because they couldn't sell it on for 7 years, and it's at this point that stories of it being bad luck began to appear in the American press. The Sultan of Turkey was deposed in 1909, but remember, he may not have owned the diamond, and the story that one of his mistresses was murdered after having worn it can again be traced to Cartier's interview with Evelyn Walsh and is mentioned in her memoir. There is no evidence that it was ever owned by anyone by the names of Jacques Collet, Prince Ivan Knitovitsky, or Simon Montherides, and as near as I can tell, the stories that these men, along with several other people, owned the diamond and met with sticky ends come from this 1921 book by Henry Layford Gates, and in part based on information from May Yo, the former Lady Hope. It concludes with this entertaining but highly fictionalized list of owners and their grisly fates, right above an advert for another book asking, "Have you read The Blonde Vampire? Read it now," which I found pretty hilarious and which I think you should take as an indication of how seriously you shouldn't be taking this so-called source. Between this list and the stories Cartier span for Evelyn Walsh McLean, it's no wonder the diamond has such outlandish legends attached to it. Of all its confirmed owners, perhaps the most unfortunate, next to Louis XVI, was in fact Mrs. McLean herself. She did indeed lose her young son to a car accident. He was knocked down. Her daughter did later take her own life, and her husband, Ned McLean, did go broke, losing the Washington Post newspaper, which he owned, developing a drinking problem, and ending up in a mental hospital. Her own attitude to the curse varied, however. She brushed it aside at the time she purchased the diamond, telling Cartier, "Bad luck objects for me are lucky," though she also said in her memoirs that she wouldn't let her children touch it, just in case. Years after her death, the postman who delivered the diamond to the Smithsonian in 1958 also suffered a series of misfortunes, but he was highly skeptical about the curse, and when his house burnt down, he pointed out that it was in fact lucky that none of his children were inside at the time. Let's remember too that he didn't even own the diamond, nor was he related to anyone who had. A lot of this sounds pretty bad, I know, but this list doesn't include all the people who owned the Hope and who are not supposed curse victims. There was Tavernier, Louis XIV, and Louis XV, for instance. We don't know who had it between 1792 and 1812, but there's no evidence that anything bad happened to them, nor are there stories of bad fortune following Daniel Eliasson, George IV, Henry Philip Hope, his nephew and great-niece, Pierre Cartier, or Harry Winston. A big part of the problem here, I think, is that if you look at anyone's life, especially those who have been famous and whose lives are therefore well documented, you'll always find instances of bad fortune, because sadly, that's the way of the world. King George's only legitimate child, Princess Charlotte, died in childbirth with her baby son, for instance, but no one ever suggested it was a curse on the family. Unfortunately, maternal mortality was simply much higher in the centuries before modern medicine. We also see a lot of tangential links in the story of the diamond, with the effects of the curse being attributed to people connected to its owners when no stories of bad fortune can be attached to the owners themselves. The story of Louis XIV's mistress wearing it and losing royal favour is one example. We might also ask, why have all the curators who have handled the diamond since it went to the Smithsonian not been stricken by this curse too, if it was strong enough to affect the life of a mere postman who happened to deliver it once? And why aren't all those who view it in the museum similarly affected? Ultimately, I think something which has as long a history and which has passed through as many hands as the Hope diamond has will always have been owned by a person or persons along the way who had something bad happen to them or their loved ones. As Evelyn Walsh McLean wisely wrote after years of owning it, tragedies for anyone who lives are not escapable. No doubt if we set our minds to it, we could come up with curses and apparent evidence for them for most, if not all, famous jewels in the world, and indeed some of them are rumoured to hold such curses. I don't believe this stone has any magical properties, however, and I don't think the American people need to worry that it's going to bring about the fall of their nation. In actual fact, it has proven very good luck for the National Museum of Natural History, where it is one of the most popular exhibits and has helped to greatly boost its visitor numbers. I'd love to know what you make of all this, though. Let me know in the comments below if you think the diamond is cursed, or if the stories around it are a mix of hysteria and good PR. Remember to give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel too. If you're interested in stories about famous treasures, why not try my video on the mystery surrounding the lost amber room next, which was stolen by the Nazis and disappeared during the chaos of World War II. I'll be back next week with another piece of history to hopefully fascinate and amuse you, and until then, keep learning.